Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending the final session of our NENA and Co-Housing Australia Housing Week. We hope you've come along to many of the sessions and enjoyed it. I always learn more and more attending these events with so many great speakers, and I hope that that's the same for everyone. I also learn all the stuff that I don't know and realize that I have so much more to learn, and that these speakers could speak for much, much longer and I would still be just madly trying to absorb it all. Today we have 3 different sessions. We have the session now from 10 until 11 with Jasmine, Gary and Stephen. And then from 11 till 12, we'll have our Indigenous speakers who have moved from yesterday's session to join us today. And then from 12 till 1, we'll have our roundtable discussion groups around the issues that we've discussed during the week. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm situated, which is the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continuous connection to country, community and culture. And I hope that as we move towards greater reconciliation, we're able to use more and more of their wisdom and knowledge in helping us all live better in this place. And I'd also like to acknowledge the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency, and acknowledge that everything we do needs to move us towards safer operating conditions if we're to live happily on this planet. So now I would like to hand over to Stephen, who's going to kick off this morning's session. You're just on mute.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Elena. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak today, and I might just get into it since we only have 10 minutes each. I'll share screen. There you go. And share screen, excellent. So I'm going to talk about what we're calling circular economy villages. It's a form of what we might call regenerative villages. And how does the slide go? There you go. So just in the general overview, I'm going to suggest that the housing crisis is only one symptom of a broader systemic problem, as many people in NENA already know. So my argument is that the solution must be systemic. You can't think in terms of just housing in order to address the housing issue. And so I put it that a village is as an economic system that provides all our needs, housing, food, water, energy, and other things, is the way forward in terms of addressing all of these issues systematically. And then I'm going to talk about why this is an opportunity for rural and regional areas. So I'm going to start with food economics, just to demonstrate the point, and address this issue of the myth, what I call the myth of supply shortages. So in Australia, Australian farmers produce enough food to feed 61 million people, but Australia's population is 25 million, and there's 1 million Australians affected by food insecurity. So this is clearly not a problem of supply, supporting people to produce more so that everyone will have enough. There is more than enough food being produced. It's just being sold overseas instead of holding a reserve for everyone in Australia to be fed. And so what we're doing is exporting water and minerals rather than providing food locally. So that brings me to the first element of this argument, that we should be localizing, putting food directly where housing is. So integrating food with housing as part of the solution. I'll just come back to the myth of supply shortages as it applies to housing. And it's the same sort of issue. 50% of the housing we produce is sold to migrants. And so this is an article that's just come up recently. Developers are saying that the housing market's going to collapse because we've turned off the tap. We're not allowing migrants in to buy all the housing. And so they say immigration is a key driver for housing, but it's a key driver for house prices. They don't want to sell locally to the people who don't have housing here. They want to sell it overseas where they can get a higher price. And this is not an issue of blaming migrants. This is a deliberate government policy to step up the amount of migrants coming in. And this happened after the GFC and the mining boom ended, that we want our economy to be driven by the construction industry. And for that to happen, we have to increase migration to allow that to happen. So these are symptoms of a systemic economic problem. What we do is we increase supply of all commodities to power the economy. That's the language it's always being used. But if supply increases too much, it exceeds demand and prices would then fall, making them affordable, of course. And so what we do is we increase demand from overseas, and that just increases the cycle. And effectively what we're creating is a pyramid scheme where you need new people to keep coming in order to power the economy. And so I could then go on and connect all of these other issues to the same economic logic that we've created of a pyramid scheme. And so we need systemic problems to be solved using more systemic solutions. So a lot of these things are already happening. We're talking about collective financing, shared equity schemes, collective land ownership in terms of community land trusts, collective housing in terms of co-housing and eco-villages, collective food systems in terms of a community-supported agriculture, shared energy systems, community renewable energy, shared transport system, mobility as a service. All these things are happening. What I'm arguing is that we need to put all of these things together, including a shared water system. And so instead of making housing the priority, which I know it is for people who don't have access to housing, but in order to address the issue, we need to think of it much more systemically and work from the ground up. And by that, I mean working with water systems and energy systems to enhance the capacity of land to provide, to support people, to sustain people. So the land sustains us, and we have to enhance the land to manage the water system, improve the food system, provide energy. And when the land is sustaining us, we can put housing in that place. And so we integrate all of those things, food, water, energy, housing and transport, and we create a system, a village as a system that provides our needs. And then we can replicate this system and create a network of villages, which is the broader project that we're working towards. So our vision is for planning for a network of high-tech regenerative villages that strive towards self-sufficiency and zero waste within their bioregion, and they'd house 200 people with all that infrastructure that we talk about. And then we talk about land availability. Oh, there's not enough land to provide all this housing. Well, this is just a map of our continent, as you know, and there's lots of land there. The question is not about land, it's about the regulatory restrictions in terms of zoning and the infrastructure capacity that we have. So we talked about providing infrastructure as a way of allowing that housing to happen, but it also unlocks the regulatory issue. So if you can provide the infrastructure, then the land can be rezoned. So, so then you can build that network across those places. So, and just to address the potential issue that people would be concerned that we're going to put housing all across all our rural areas, what I'm talking about is zoning a very small portion to demonstrate the footprint that we have in terms of our urban area. So the urban zone in any of these developments would be only 10 to 15% of the entire site, and the rest will be managed ecological systems. So examples of what's happening already. This is a project in Adelaide, Lockhill Park, and this is the extent of savings you can get in terms of water systems and greenhouse gas emissions, energy reduction by going to these sort of projects. And Cape Patterson in Victoria, 88% reduction in electricity compared to 6-star rated homes. They also have a work hub on site, food and gardens, open space, bush regeneration, all of these things happen. So that's all I have, just to put it out there about thinking in systems and dealing with all those things together. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. We might move straight on to Jasmine Palmer, and please feel free to start popping any questions you have in the chat.
Okay, just getting my screen ready. Is that visible to everyone now?
Yep.
Yep, great. Okay, thanks, Stephen, for getting today's session started, and thanks for inviting me to come along and speak. So today's session's titled Innovation and New Ways Forward. And throughout the week, we've had a lot of speakers talk about, different models of legal, financial or governing structures and different innovative ways we can begin to own, share and systematise what is often seen as the commodity of housing. So I'm just going to talk today about how we can think about innovation in terms of infill housing. So Stephen's introduced to us, more of a rural context. My work is in more of an urban context. So we're making that sort of slight jump into the urban context. So, as we know, as we're well aware and has been mentioned over the week, Australia is very much dominated by the suburban home, particularly post-World War II, and it has been noted in the international context that Australians have an unusually high capacity to influence the design and construction of their own dwellings compared to, for example, UK and America and other similar sort of economies. However, we have this long legacy of suburban freestanding or separate houses. But currently, about half of people who are looking to buy in the next 5 years don't expect to be in a separate house. And about 1/5 of us, or 20% of us, do not want to live in a separate house. Yet it's the main option that's made available to us in Australia. So how do we innovate around this and make a difference? Well, we know that the individual house is not the predominant thing in provision anymore. So over the last 10 years, more than 50% of dwellings produced in Melbourne and Sydney are now not freestanding. And we have all these, this increasingly long history of urban plans promoting consolidation and building within existing urban fabrics. So we think about the different ways we can access housing in Australia, and here I'm thinking about over 70% of people who do own a dwelling. We can access separate dwelling. Oops, that shouldn't have gone. We can access separate dwellings by building our own, self-commissioning or buying an existing. But with the consolidation plans which promote consolidation in our cities, really we can buy an existing apartment or non-separate house or townhouse, or we can buy one off the plan. But we don't really have a system in Australia, and this is the system thinking that, of course, Stephen also raised, is that we can't build a non-separate house. By that I mean a townhouse or an apartment. We don't have a system in Australia to build that for ourselves. So as we move into this, age of consolidation and higher density development in urban areas, the tradition that we have of providing our own housing and having a big influence on realising our own dwellings is removed. So the connection between the resident or who's going to live in these kind of dwellings and the design of them is far more distanced. So the system that's currently providing multi-unit dwellings in consolidating urban environments is one which is very speculative, in which most of the decisions are made by developers, and we have all these sort of perverse consequences that come as a result of that. Theoretically, the argument always goes, well, if we build on smaller land and we build a smaller house, it should be cheaper. The reality is that it's not, and most of that is due to the fact that developers seek greater profit out of higher density dwellings than what they achieve out of lower density dwellings. So the residents are paying more to the developer as part of that profit. So in terms of thinking about, innovation and ways forward in this context, in this urban context, I like to think about how we can develop systems which are shifting that towards a non-speculative development process. So instead of developers building something and selling it on, how can we develop without developers, for example, to use a term that was used in Germany by Jung to describe building groups that happened there. So this is about establishing more of a connection between the residents, here it's labelled owner-occupiers, but generally residents of dwellings, and the actual production of the dwellings themselves. So we could call this developing without developers. We could call it non-speculative development. One of the advantages of this kind of process is that it can be cheaper. So, we can realise some of those savings that should occur through having less land and smaller dwellings, which I won't go into great detail on those. So what this notion of developing without developers, who currently does this? Well, happens in multiple locations around the world, where groups of people come together and develop, say, townhouses or an apartment building for their own use. It's quite common in Argentina, where it's led by professionals, like architects instigate projects. It's increasingly common through the notion of building groups or Baugruppe in Germany and German-speaking countries. We have some examples of smaller projects in the UK with people developing together for their own occupation. And we actually have, like Tim Riley presented last night, I believe, at the session on financing, etc., examples of things happening in Melbourne as well through organisations like property collectives. So why would we want to do this? So research across all those different countries has sort of shown that the motivations people have to do this is because they're looking for a better environmental outcome. They're looking for a more affordable outcome. Or the example of the Older Women's Housing Cooperative in London, they're looking for more of a community connection and support. So these are addressing, many of the issues that our speakers have spoken about over the course of the week. So there's, this is one way in which we can bring some of those, I think, things to the fore. So just as an example, this is one that anyone who's seen me present before knows that this is one of my favourites. It's 5 or 6 years old now, but this is Brefeld in Berlin. And what I find fascinating about this project is that we look at it first, it looks like the project is those 3 white buildings in the foreground. That's a single apartment development comprising those 3 white buildings. And we look at it first, it just looks like a regular apartment. But what's going on here is that a whole bunch of people who are going to be living there in the future have worked together to develop the brief, to work out how this thing's going to be built. And we've had people speak this week about the need for older people to access smaller, more efficient apartments, like maybe the notion of tiny houses. And we've had people talk about the need for a diversity of outcomes, creating a systemic structure in which we can have diverse housing types rather than a monotony of housing forms. So what we see in this project is a whole bunch of people who've come together, ranging from single older people to people with disabilities to families with young children, and their needs have all been designed in and met throughout this project. So the diversity of housing sizes, forms and interactions that occur in this single development is quite unique. So just as one example, they have these floors in some of the buildings called cluster units, where these are designed for older residents, and essentially they're quite a small, tiny house, similar to what Richard presented earlier in the week, but here they're in an apartment context. And they have adjoining supporting spaces, so a common kitchen, but even though you have your own sort of private kitchen within your dwelling. So this is referred to as a cluster unit in this particular project. And it's looking a bit like this. So we have very small private spaces and larger shared spaces. So I just want to run through, what are some of the benefits if we think about innovating in this way and changing the system of multi-unit development so that residents can have more of a say. So to the question of why develop without developers? Well, one thing we see looking at the different projects around the world in the locations I suggested is that we remove some of the barriers to innovation. So we talked earlier in the week about how, you know, banks and other things that, it's not a very innovative industry, the housing industry. Whereas when projects are led by future residents or architects, we tend to see greater innovation in construction technologies occurring. So these are on the right here, this is a timber building, a model of construction that's not typical in that context. And you know, these innovative balconies that fold out of buildings in a way that maybe a developer wouldn't consider doing. So I'm just going to run through some benefits quickly. Self-development can enable, even in a multi-unit or apartment context, a degree of DIY, which is something Australians, we're very much into it. We like to save a bit of money, do a bit of things ourselves, but the current sort of apartment development process doesn't really allow us to do that. Whereas this is Sprefeld again, where the common facilities were left unfinished and the community could come together and work on those collectively. It also removes split incentives. So split incentives being the notion that, well, why would a developer invest more in a higher environmental performing building when they're not the ones who benefit from it? You've got these split incentives. So, you know, the very first zero carbon rated building in the UK that was built without any government subsidy was done in this way, with residents coming together and saying, where is it we want to live and what do we want to live in? Another negative side of the speculative system of development is that it's aimed at the average household, or the household that can provide the developer with the greatest return. So being able to say, well, I know I'm going to live in this building, I want to design it for me, removes that notion of the average household. So not everyone would want a library like this above their kitchen, but it's specific to this user. Not everyone would want to say, I don't want a bedroom, I'm going to sleep on the floor in my lounge room, but that's what this specific user decided to do. So being able to remove that notion of the typical and allowing things to be designed to meet the needs of a specific household. And as I mentioned earlier, developing without developers can be cheaper. So we can talk about these in more detail, but there's some fascinating figures there about a project that was completed about 10 years ago in Hafen City in Hamburg. And there's a lot of documented research on the positive influence that these kinds of projects where people develop for themselves, the positive influence they can have on the neighbourhoods around them. So when we're thinking about urban renewal and we're thinking about how we have such a community resistance to densification within our cities, this is a really good way of getting people on board and designing cities for people rather than designing cities for profit. So as we said at the beginning, in Australia at the moment, we have basically no systems for people to self-build their own separate houses. But I'm pleased to say not only do we have some small things going on in Australia, but I'm involved in this group called Urban Coop that some of you have heard of earlier in the week. And at the moment we have, I'll be bold and say Australia's first co-housing apartment building that's been designed for the future residents by the future residents is currently under construction and will be moving in December. So I find that very exciting and look forward to living there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. Gary, are you ready to go? Some slides as well. Thank you.
Share my screen here and then I'll be ready to go. Are you all seeing that presentation?
Yep, good to go.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the invite. And thank you to NENA and the organizers for setting up this housing conference all week. It's been great. I'm going to talk about why we need community land trusts. I'm not going to explain them because Louise Crabtree Hayes did that last night. I'm going to talk a little bit in a broader, more systemic way, which I liked that Stephen was also talking that way. And my background real quickly, I lived in the largest community land trust in the world for 10 years in Burlington, Vermont. And I also happen to have a PhD in the economics of common property. Let's see if I can get this to move. Okay. So here's a deeper question. I found this on Twitter, and I thought this was a great question. Why does a wealthy nation like Australia not have sufficient housing? And it sounds like a simple question, but it's really profound. We certainly have a problem. This was from the Prosper Australia recent issue showing the runaway land prices. I read somewhere that property prices in Sydney are going to go up about $100,000 this year, which is actually less than 10% of the average house price. And I call that money for nothing and chicks for free. So why is that? I'm going to talk about proximate cause and ultimate cause, which just means the obvious reasons and then the more fundamental, deeper reasons. So one of the obvious reasons is the property lobby. And these are the banks, developers, realtors, speculators, builders, and the politicians who serve them, plus the 8 million homeowners. And they all want property values to go up. And then you've got the 100,000 new home buyers, plus the renters who want property values to go down. So that's an 80-to-1 ratio against affordable housing. So it's no wonder that there's no focus on affordable housing. Another reason is the Australian dream. Do you want to go against a dream? And that is buy a house, get rich owning real estate, sell your massively inflated asset, downsize and retire. By the way, that's exactly the same as the American dream, if you weren't aware of that. Now, if you talk to a politician, the answer, as Stephen mentioned, is increase the supply. That's the problem. It doesn't matter if they're liberal, labor, progressive, conservatives, it makes absolutely no difference. The problem is not enough housing supply. Of course, that's obvious, right? And look at everything, they'll say, look at everything we're doing. Wow, we are putting all of these subsidies into the housing market. Look how great we are. $74 billion, I calculated 6 years ago, and I'm sure it's higher now, of annual subsidies for the housing market. And what they don't know is all of these things increase the price of housing. They don't reduce it. Which reminds me of my favorite Mark Twain quote. He said, imagine you're an idiot. Now imagine that you're a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. So the ultimate cause, I believe, the deeper cause is market fundamentalism. It's his quasi-religious belief in the free market and free enterprise that will solve everything. And, you know, Adam Smith wrote the Invisible Hand of the Market in 1776. So we've had 245 years of free market competition. So don't you think the market would have solved it by now? If it was ever going to solve it? Well, this is what you call a market failure. And why are people confused? Well, because free enterprise and technology are amazing. We've got this incredible, profusion of disruptive technologies that are making our lives better all the time, and because of this thing called Wright's Law, which is very simple. It just means that the more you make of something, the less it costs. Economies of scale decline, prices decline due to economies of scale. And we get all this disruptive technology, what Schumpeter called creative destruction. And this is kind of giving away my age, but if you look at the dotted red line on the right there, everything below that was invented in my lifetime. The one that everybody's probably familiar with is Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, who founded Intel, wrote this article in 1965, and he said the number of transistors on a microchip was going to double every 2 years. And it's still true to this day. It's still doubling every 18 months to 2 years. The net result is massive declining cost of microelectronics. If you look at the cost of of a gigabyte of memory in 1956, it was $10 million. And in 2010, it was 9 cents. And I think as of 2020, it's about 4 cents. Now let's compare that with the price of land. It looks slightly different, doesn't it? So even a politician might be able to tell the difference between this declining cost curve and this increasing one. It works exactly the opposite of product markets. And I hold the economists responsible for this. I think they're guilty of fraud because increased demand for products causes the price to go down. You've got in microelectronics, you've got like 10 or 20 companies competing with each other, constantly driving the price down. When it comes to land, you have a fixed supply. So when demand increases, the price goes up. The land market does exactly the opposite of the product market. And that's why the free market does not work for land like it works for everything else. And that's why everybody is so confused. So the conclusion is the market will never solve the housing problem. Let me repeat that. The free market will never solve the housing problem. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire to put it out. And that's because land is a false commodity. If you read Karl Polanyi, one of my favorite writers. So it is a market failure. So what's the solution? Well, you need housing that's not part of the market. A community land trust takes land out of the market forever, builds a firewall around it, a legal structure that keeps it out of the market in perpetuity and keeps housing affordable because it's non-market housing. And our pilot project is in the Southern Moreton Bay Islands. It's a Southern Moreton Bay Islands Community Land Trust. The only thing we're missing right now is a construction loan to build our first unit. And so if anyone has $150,000, let me know. A little bit sort of deeper question is, how is it that banks rule the world? And you may not know this, but 97% of the money supply comes from interest-bearing bank loans. And 75 to 85% of those are for real estate. So what we need is an entirely new sector of financial institutions that provide financing for non-market land, like CLTs and co-ops and so forth. These can be public banks, community banks, loan funds, revolving loan funds. We have to create this whole parallel system of financing for non-market land because banks at this point aren't too keen on it because they don't make as much money on it as the last presenter showed. They want the housing as big and as expensive as possible. So we have to create this whole parallel financing structure. And for more information, there's my email, our websites, and I highly recommend you read the best book of the 20th century, which was The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I'm sure someone will be in touch with the cash.
Okay. Looking forward.
Yeah. Just put your bank details on that final slide.
Yeah, I'll put my BSB number
Please feel free to add any more questions into the chat. We've had one around the, I think, financial model that you're thinking of using, Stephen. I don't know if you want to chat a little bit more about that.
I might just go from the top of the questions. So there's one from Karen asking, have any of these villages started yet? So in terms of the full-blown model that I've described, no. The space that we're working in is kind of trying to bridge together all of these like alternative ideas around eco-villages, co-housing, community land trust, etc., with the mainstream market, which is where I've come from in terms of doing greenfield housing developments and trying to bring them across into that space. So I'm trying to bridge that gap. And so I've been working with different, together with my partner, I've been working with different councils. In Bellingen, we've been working with them while they developed their housing strategy, and they adopted an action to build a pilot project together with us. So that's the most advanced. We're now having some conversations with Lake Macquarie, and there's also been some opportunities have come up in Victoria. So they're all kind of at the very early stages. So that's where we're at in terms of developing them. So the next question from Mary was about ways to engage with councils. I kind of mentioned already that you have to start with the housing strategy, and basically when they're developing that strategy, you work with them to enable that option to be implemented. So the way planning policy works is that if it's in a strategy, it can flow through to all the other policies, infrastructure plans, development control plans, etc. So you need to get it in a strategy in terms of, you know, if you're talking about a model like we're talking about, which is an entire new village. So yeah, that's how we're engaging with councils. And if you're interested in doing that, just please contact us, and rather than everyone or different people doing similar sorts of things, if we can, you know, and this is to Mary Faith, who raised this question. If you're interested in doing it, just contact us. Eileen Watson talked about any community land trusts in Australia. I think Gary would be better off answering that question. And that's it, I think, in terms of questions that were put to me for now. Gary, do you want to answer that question about community land trusts in Australia?
Sure. There's a lot of groups that are formed, that are trying to get going, but as far as I know, there's no actual housing being provided yet. There's a lot of groups that started forming around 2008 after Louise Crabtree organized a 350-page manual and had a big conference, but nobody's been able to do it yet. And we were working with all these groups for 6 years, and then we realized that we needed a pilot project because someone has to break the ice. That's really what's missing, is a working model. So that's why we're trying to build that model down in the southern Moreton Bay Islands.
Actually, I might also add to that answer. I think this is where I sometimes struggle with the different spaces and the different language and jargon that we use. Like a community land trust is a generic term for the structure, the financial collective ownership structure of the land on which you will be building co-housing. So there's a lot of information in the co-housing space that should intersect with the legal and administrative structures for owning the land. So, and then there's another body of knowledge around eco-villages that is kind of intersects with co-housing and often has community land trusts in it, but they're kind of different spaces that that should be working together. And also the Bauer Group and model, the collective ownership or collective building process is that Jasmine talked about, is also kind of in the similar space. One talks to the legal structures, one talks about the design, and the other talks about the building process. And all of those things are part of creating the end product that you want. And we need to start thinking more systemically and merging those ideas.
Yeah, I would just make a small correction. A community land trust can encompass any one of those other types of housing, not just co-housing, because it's a legal agreement between the community organization and the resident. And all it really boils down to is that the resident doesn't take the capital gain when they move out. It stays with the community, and that's how it stays affordable. And therefore it can encompass any type of community housing out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this becomes part of the challenge that people think that these are all very different and discrete models, but there's actually some that are more relevant from a social community perspective, some that are really more purely about the financial means and how that is structured and how people interact with that. And then there is the physicality, the typology, and the planning context that they might originate in. Jasmine, maybe you can jump in here and talk a little bit more about the social benefits to within communities, but also with the broader neighbourhood.
Sure. That research I mentioned was something that was done in Germany, in some cities that basically had large areas of land for redevelopment, and those large areas of urban renewal were done through a series of building groups. So as Stephen said, our grouping is just a building group. It's just building together. It doesn't mean co-housing necessarily. What was done in those areas was an analysis of social cohesion, not only among the residents within individual dwellings, but across the area of urban renewal, and then also beyond the boundaries of those areas of urban renewal, to see what sort of flow through effect these community-driven buildings had on the more distant neighbourhood as well. And they're really interesting results there. So I think I put a reference to that in the chat. Yeah. I think there's an interesting question there from Elle for Gary, which you've said yes to in the answer there, Gary, but I think I'd like to ask that question a bit further about your financial structure in terms of proposed CLTs and how people sell out of or move on from dwellings within
Right.
CLT.
So as Louise explained last night, CLTs devise their own formula for, but what they all have in common is whatever money that you pay into the principal on the loan, you get back. You just don't get all the capital gain. So you're able to accumulate equity. So for example, when I lived in a 2-bedroom townhouse for 6 years in Burlington, and when I moved out, I took $12,000 with me that I had paid down on the mortgage. So that you get back. Now, how much of the gain you get depends on the individual organization. Some of them use the consumer price index. Some of them use a percentage formula and so forth. Like a limited equity co-op, which I also lived in, they gave me back my original purchase price adjusted for inflation. So I put in, I think, $3,000, they give me back $3,300, and then plus whatever I paid down on the mortgage loan. Now, in the case of the townhouse or like individual housing, they are a little bit more liberal. In the case of Burlington, they will give you 25% of the capital gain, and the organization keeps 75%, and then they recycle that back for the next resident, so it stays affordable. So basically, in terms of adjusted for inflation, the next owner paid pretty much the same that I paid. So it stays affordable forever. They call that's why they call it in perpetuity, because it stays affordable forever, because the owner doesn't take the profit with them when they leave.
Great. Thanks very much.
And
Yeah.
by the way, there's something that came up a minute ago. Just to give you an example of the Burlington Community Land Trust, they have on their property, and Louise mentioned this, they have 3,000 properties. That includes co-ops, rentals, single family, multi-family apartment buildings. It includes agriculture. It includes some co-housing units. And it even has commercial. There's a homeless shelter, and there's some commercial properties where people run nonprofit businesses. So it can encompass anything. It's just a legal agreement not to take the profit. That's all it is. That's all it comes down to.
It seems so easy and straightforward, Gary.
Well, but it goes
just get it
against
done.
the entire philosophy of our society, which is to take the profit. So you're going against, you know, this dream. And so it's really hard to get people's mind around it. And I'll tell you a story. Even after they've been trained, they don't have to put down a down payment, for example. It's one of the benefits. They're saving like 1/3 of the cost of the mortgage. And at the end of it, my friend who works at the one in Burlington, he said people will come up to him and say, why don't I get to keep the profit? They've been through like hours and hours of training, and they still ask that question because it's so ingrained, so indoctrinated that the whole purpose of real estate is to make a profit. So when you go against that, you know, you're going against a dream.
Yeah, we certainly discussed this earlier in the week as well around people needing to have a rethink about their rights and responsibilities and their obligations and freedoms. You know, there's it needs to move from that individualistic mindset to the collaborative societal mindset, and that is a big cultural shift.
And the funny thing is that I actually came out ahead. As if I had bought my unit on the market, I would have actually been worse off financially, because if you count the savings, I saved $250 a month on my mortgage, and then I took $12,000 out. I think I calculated that I walked out with the equivalent of $19,000, and if I had bought it on the market, I would have taken out like $14,000. So I even came out ahead financially, but I was able to pass the savings on to the next person.
And I mean, I think we're also going to see more shifts in thinking as we tackle more issues similar to COVID and other climate related issues, which will include food security. And I'm wondering, Jasmine, if you can talk a little bit about any examples that you know where there are urban agriculture associated with any of the projects that you've seen, because I know Stephen's talking about how we can include the protection of conservation area for habitat and also the production of food, and I'm wondering how that might translate into urban and suburban contexts.
Yeah, there has been a number of proposals in urban contexts for multi-storey buildings that integrate food production and residences. Most of those have been in France and have struggled to get funding, but that's a common theme across all of the kinds of projects that we've been talking about, is the struggle to get funding. Look, most of them, though, where you do see that integration between residents and food production are more sort of peri-urban. So things like, in Australian examples, the Aldinga Eco Village and things like that. So I've not seen great success in the urban context, but definitely proposals. You know, I think in terms of, you know, this topic of, well, innovation and what are the new ways forward, I think it's worth noting that, you know, when does innovation occur? It occurs when, you know, in this case, a housing system, because we're talking housing, a system, or in this case, a housing system, fails to meet the needs of those people who are involved with it. So if it's not meeting the needs of its residents, if it's not meeting the needs of, you know, the people who want to dwell in that location, then we seek innovation. We want things to change because the system that's in place is not working. And it's these sort of moments of market failure that I think allow innovation to occur. So I say bring on market failure so that we can get banks to be thinking differently. Because, you know, a lot of the challenges around these kinds of things is that banks don't see your CLTs or, you know, as freely tradable assets, so they won't fund them. So, you know, we need to see this sort of even more of a breakdown of the housing system for us to rebuild it back up again. So I think, you know, there's places where opportunities lie, and I think it's really interesting to see where around the world where CLTs have been established and running is they've established themselves in moments of market failure. They very often establish themselves in moments when land is very, very cheap. And I've not yet seen examples of CLTs establishing themselves successfully and independently in locations of high market demand. So we're responding to sort of a failure through unaffordability with alternative ways of procurement or ownership, but it's hard to break through where the system, from its own perception, is actually success. It's making money for those who are involved with it. It's only a failure for those who aren't in it. So until it fails for those who are already in it as well, then we've got, you know, little opportunity to break through and make those significant changes.
Jasmine, one comment. You're right, mostly right, I'd say, but there's one exception, which is Orcas Island in the San Juan Islands has extremely expensive real estate, and they have a successful community land trust, but
yeah, through altruistic donation.
Right, so exactly, but in most cases, you're right, it's a response to a crisis.
Could I just add to that question for the issue of crisis and collapse and how do we respond? I think what is interesting is the COVID crisis has actually caused a number of interesting shifts in the housing market. There's definitely a shift that like regional organisations are encouraging of people leaving the cities and moving to rural areas. So there's been a significant increase in rural house prices, rural and regional areas. And also a shift from the inner city to suburban housing. So people not wanting to live in apartments and wanting to live in detached housing. So that's one reason why house prices are going up. Another interesting change is within the system itself. Someone earlier mentioned the New South Wales Housing Diversity SEP. So the state government is now encouraging some of these alternative models, both in its planning policies and it's in tax structures. So particular models they're advancing are co-living, what they're calling co-living, which is really targeted towards digital nomads, so a more inner city type development that is collectively owned by the developer post-development and managed and operated for short-term rentals. So, and I'm talking about 6 months to a year. So co-living and build to rent as another alternative. And there's also dramatically increasing demand due to aging population for retirement villages. And so the character of retirement villages is changing from a more clinical environment to a more organic environment. And they're also looking for more multi-generational environments rather than, you know, being put out to pasture. So yeah, so there's a number of shifts happening in the housing market at the moment, partly due to the long-term economics of it, that housing is no longer affordable for a lot of people, partly due to the lack of migrants coming in. And partly due to innovation that's happening overseas that we're kind of slow to import here around ideas of co-living and build to rent.
Yeah, yeah, Jasmine?
I just wanted to respond to Jane's earlier question, which asked, does Urban Coop and other Nightingale properties have CLT arrangements? So Jane, you're right. Nightingale are developing the building on behalf of Urban Coop, and none of these projects have CLT-like arrangements. What they do have is a resale covenant which restricts profit seeking. So it says that yes, you can resell your apartment for what you paid for it plus the profit of the local area, the rising value of the local area, but you can't sell it where you begin to realise that development profit that was excluded right at the beginning. So that saving has to be passed on, but they're certainly not CLTs. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, great. Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum, I think, of potential in terms of how much that affordability can be passed on, and some of these innovations might seem good on the face of them, but there is a real risk of exploitation, especially down the track if the ethos changes over time. If there's not that, I think the benefit of the CLT model with the really broad stakeholder engagement has the best possibility. So as long as we have models that follow more of that path, I think we'll be able to see longitudinal benefits. I'm checking a note from Michelle. Yes, I agree. I think we need a bit of a break. So I wanted to ask questions about DIY because I think Bunnings sausages are going to make a comeback post-COVID. But I think we'll go for a 5-minute break and have you back here at 5 past for the Indigenous speakers. Is that okay, Michelle? Feel free to jump on and.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just aware that we had come up to the hour and I think Ross and Bevan are ready to go. So if everyone would like to just have a quick stretch and jump back onto the call, we'll see you in a minute. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. It's 11:05. I might just see if folks are ready to resume. A huge thank you to the speakers in our previous session. Thank you so much, Steve, Jasmine, and Gary. I think that was a very thought-provoking and excellent session. And in a moment, I'd like to introduce our two speakers in our Indigenous Perspectives session. But first, I just might see if Elena had any other housekeeping. Are you there, Elena? She's still off a cup of tea.
All good, ready to go.
Excellent. Okay, well, hi everyone. For anyone who hasn't joined us this week, my name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA. And I want to really thank Elena, Pereya and Co-Housing Australia for working with me as we've developed the program for this week. And I do hope that for those of you who've been able to join some of the sessions, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Speakers have been amazing, and it's a really brilliant way to catch up on a sort of summary across so many different issues. I've just brought up our website to remind everyone of the journey we've had. On Monday night, we started with an introduction to housing issues, including an excellent overview of the housing issues by Emily Sims, and a deep dive into capitalism, private property and future value with Louise Crabtree-Hayes. We then had a number of sessions on finding solutions. I won't talk you through all of them, but do please note that we're putting the PowerPoints up for any of the speakers who sends their PowerPoints, or they'll be hot linked to their name on the public program by next week. And all of the recordings for all of the sessions will also be here, easy to find and easy to rewatch or listen to again if you want to. But without further ado, I'm really delighted that Ross Williams from Future Dreaming, and also from his own consulting work, and Bevan Cassady from QCOSS are able to join us today. Thanks to everyone for your patience as I had to change the session yesterday into what we're looking at today. And what we'll do is we'll have at least 50 minutes for Ross and Bevan they'll have up 15-ish minutes each to chat. And then we'll have a discussion about Indigenous perspectives and issues with the housing in Australia. And then I really hope that after a 5-minute break, you'll all come back. And I just wanted to very quickly flag with you that the facilitated discussion, although it's a little bit shorter, the main thing we want to do is work with all of our wonderful speakers who are still on the call today. Not everyone's able to join us, but all of our speakers and all of our other participants. We'll co-create a couple of breakout groups, and the main goal is really to just think about what are some of the core issues you'd like to see addressed more effectively in Australian society, and in particular, how would you articulate that to other people in Australian society? One of the reasons we're keen to get people's input from our Housing Week, while all these ideas are fresh and bubbling, is we want, as NENA, to be able to communicate about housing issues to other people who may not be involved in the sector, who don't understand the issues. And by developing a list, I know it sounds a bit clunky, but within an hour, we can't really develop anything too sophisticated. But given this is our first attempt over the last 8 months to develop a co-created, not just a vision, but a bit of an action plan for what are all the different things we want to do to build our new or wellbeing economy. And whether you do that through the sectors like we're doing today, or you just pop your own ideas in, this is a Google Doc. I'll give you the link in the chat for anyone who's sitting and wanting to type a few ideas in, or you can just wait until we have our 1-hour session and we'll break into groups, but we'll do all of that together. So please don't feel like you have to do any homework right now. I'm going to stop sharing. So I guess I just wanted to let you know that we will be having a nice discussion in the final hour today. But right now, I'm pretty sure that Bevan is on. Oh, you are there, good. I could see Beva, and I was hoping that was you. So Bevan Cassady and Ross Williams, you've both got co-hosting rights. So if you do have slides, feel free to share. If you don't, that's okay. I'd like to first introduce Ross Williams. Ross will introduce himself in the appropriate way for country, but I just want to acknowledge that Ross and I have known each other for a couple of decades now, and I've always been in deep admiration of Ross's work, both for youth who are at risk of suicide and other harmful activities, supporting and mentoring people in his community, as well as having a long and established career in land care, conservation, Indigenous protected areas, and a whole bunch of other things that we've worked on through Future Dreaming. Ross has some really excellent and important insights into the systemic issues that face Aboriginal people in this colonial country. And I guess I should say the questions I asked or put to Ross and Bevan are really about asking what are the current issues and problems that Indigenous people are facing in Australia, and how have the ongoing legacies of colonisation, institutional racism and other problems continued to affect not just housing but other social equity issues for people today, and what might be some of these solutions. So I really am very grateful to Ross and Bevan for being with us. I'm just going to, maybe if you could unmute Ross, I might hand over to you. Yeah, so thank you so much, Ross. I'll let you introduce yourself properly. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Watamoli, everybody. And Watamoli in my language is hello, welcome. Good to see you all. And I'm sitting in Brisbane at the moment, but my traditional country is Bindal in the Townsville, the Burdekin area on my father's side. And on my mother's side, very strong ties to the Torres Strait on the eastern islands of Mare and Arab. Hopefully people can try and Google that and figure out what those islands are, because I'm not going to give you the white name, but I'll give you the traditional name. It's all good fun though. It's really important to give recognition to the traditional owners, and I want to show my respect to the traditional owners of the country whose land I'm on and where I live, but also to elders past and present, and elders on past and present who, and to the present people who are on this webinar. I want to say hello, and I'm excited to see so many faces and names, and also I want to show my recognition to Bevan, who I've never seen before or never spoken to before, but I'm sure we'll have a similar yarn. I think the topic of housing is probably one of the most difficult subjects, I guess, for Indigenous people. But one of the things I wanted to try and, I guess, start off with is really about what is a home rather than what is a house. And a home is not necessarily a structure, but Indigenous people, it's a place. And that place can, and under that can have structures, which can include natural structures, can be built structures, could be a whole variety of things. It's about home, where you belong. Now, let me take you back. So let's say 250 years or so, give or take, when a person by the name of Cook turned up and decided to stick a flag in the near Botany Bay there, and take over control of what we know now is the continent of Australia. Before that, if you go back roughly around 60 to 80,000 years, it was home for many Indigenous groups throughout this continent. So I want to give you a bit of a landscape measure of where we are, what our home looked like. So our home is described as country, and our home had a lot of values and had intrinsic values, and had many gifts for us over that term. So housing for us is home, and home is country, and country gives us our place in society. There was old Auntie Mary Graham described that we became human here, and it's a true factor, that we as Indigenous people became human on this continent. So if you give it in housing context and the content, we've been here for that long, so it's our home. So when we start about talking about, we must understand that. Now, the sweep of the colonisation took over since that time, and over a period, a lot of people, Indigenous people and groups, were basically removed from their homes by force, by disease, by murder, by genocide. We can call all these names. If you're uncomfortable with those names, you need to, I guess, understand a little bit more about Australian history. So I'm taking you on a little bit of a journey. So to get to where we are right today in terms of housing and infrastructure and what that might look like. So throughout that, we got exposed to my mob in Townsville. We got exposed to colonisation and the removal of us from our home and my ancestors around about 1863 or thereabouts. So not all that long ago in reality, not in terms of timeframes. We're still fighting for our rights and interests to regain our home. And so that's that context. Now, when we're talking about in the modern context, we're talking about a house, a structure. Someone may have talk about that structure as being 4 walls and glass and all that sort of stuff. Like some of the old people used to describe it as coffins, you know, for the living. So they found it very difficult to live in those structures. Now, the more remote and regional, the regional and remote areas that you go, the difficulty is housing. You know, and Bevan's probably going to describe exactly what the housing issues are for Indigenous people in terms of data and statistics. I don't know what he's going to say, but our housing problem is an endemic issue around intergenerational trauma. And housing has always been a very difficult thing when you are marginalised, when racism takes over from your ability to actually function in a society that is very hostile to you and that is very racist to you. There might be some trigger words in here that might offend people, but that's okay. I'm not intending to offend people. I'm just trying to give you the structure or the scope of some of the traumas and issues that Indigenous people face. So if we talk about just general housing and affordability, and so forth, you know, we're talking about a whole different sort of structure. So access is a big issue for houses, and having the infrastructure or the money to be able to actually afford even the basic things like rental or to try and be a part of society, the colonial society, is very difficult. I'll give you an example of some of the like inappropriate housing, for instance, for Indigenous people. I did a lot of work, and I still do a little bit of work in the Cape York, where they were building structures that were 3-bedroom houses with 2-car garages, totally, you know, not for the environment and totally not for what people wanted. A good description of how those houses were used, people didn't actually spend most of their time inside the actual house structure itself. They used the garage because the garage was open and it had airflow through it. So they didn't live in the structures of the houses. So totally inappropriate housing. There was one time in the 1980s where in such a really hot place like Cape York, there was an A-frame house built. Where is the snow, you know? So, I mean, this whole system of what appropriate housing is for Indigenous people is so messed up because it is a colonial structure. And each of those is supported by others who then go on and, you know, they're friends of government bureaucrats and so forth who issue contracts for building houses, but not appropriate housing. And the more centralised you come, like cities and towns and stuff, Indigenous people are finding it very difficult to actually go to the open market. I'll give you a really good example. My wife happens to be a non-Indigenous person. I have to, when we were renting, I had to send her in to get a housing rental because she was non-Indigenous. We did an experiment in the early stages of when we got married, is that I went in and they just racially profiled me immediately. We can't rent to a black fella. Well, that's what they were saying. I can see it all over their faces. So there's these racial biases and racial overtones and direct tones. So after that, my wife and I decided we're gonna play the game a little bit different. And every single time, from a rental purpose, we're able to get rental each and every time while my wife did the actual initial discussions and applications and so forth. So we scored every single time. We used to live in absolute mansions. It's only because we could afford to. We were, you know, we were classified as well-to-do. In reality, you know, in Indigenous society, in white society, I don't know. But but from a general point of view around the planet, because we had a fridge, we had food in that fridge, we had a house, we were living the life. So we were part of the 13% of the general population on this planet that were considered as wealthy. So the whole issue around Indigenous access to housing is a real major issue, and all those issues around Indigenous people being racially profiled and what that social determinants factors were involved. We've got when we look at the social determinants, we're looking at racism, we're looking at infant mortality, we're looking at chronic diseases, we're looking at mental health, we're looking at education, employment opportunities, income streams. Indigenous people are in, some of the Indigenous people are in serious issues and having serious problems. And this is all related to the social and intergenerational traumas. We've got a really disappointing increase in health issues and those social determinants. We've got issues in relation to suicide, and particularly around youth. And if and a lot of people in Australia don't even know what's going on. I really encourage people to have a look at the report, the recent report on the closing of the gap. It's been going for a while now, but we've got incarceration rates. We've got racial profiling based on people's biases, whether they be deliberate, whether they be recognised biases, and those racial intolerances that prevent Indigenous people from accessing proper education, particularly in regional and remote areas, from accessing good jobs and opportunities is very difficult. So before we even get to wanting to buy a home, we need to really get to the bottom of what those social determinant factors are. Some of the solutions are right there, and we've been talking as Indigenous people around solutions. So housing is a really important thing. It's almost like you've got to own your own home, and because that's the Australian thing to do. Indigenous people are looking at wanting to own their home, which is their country, their land, which is the Aboriginal one thing to do, you know, having responsibility and control and back to that country. So then you can then provide for your family from a social, cultural and mental wellness point of view. We have a lot of problems with some of the people with incarceration rates. I mean, the males, for instance, represent about 24% of the incarceration of imprisonment within this country. The worst part is that our women are represented by about 27% incarceration of the prison population, which is absolutely pathetic. You know, I could use other language, but I'm not going to. But the reality is all these social determinants and all these social factors really impact massively on Indigenous kids, on their well-being, because their parents' well-being is not being looked after. Their parents are not getting some of the opportunities. Now, you've got people like me that have got a smart, you know, mouth and won't tolerate behaviours that are racially biased, or and I'll call it out. But I'm one of the lucky few, you know. We've got Indigenous entrepreneurs around the place. We've got Indigenous lawyers, but they've been given an opportunity and been given a break to be able to address the fundamentals of breaking down the barriers. And but there are Indigenous people that we want to be able to lift out of that sort of level of poverty and a level of racism. If you look at it right across Australia, whether it's in the sporting arena or whether it's in the native title discussions, whether it's in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it's all racial intolerance and racial biases and negativities that are coming out. And people need to really look at themselves and start to grow a maturity about what they know about this country and about what they know about Indigenous people. So housing is a wonderful thing. I've been lucky enough to buy my own house, but that luck is created by myself and by the energies of my wife. If she wasn't there, I'd be, I'd probably be parked up somewhere in a caravan, in the picking mangoes or something. But that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. But the reality is that, and family is a really good support structure. So when we're talking about housing, we're talking about some really difficult, complicated factors. We used to have an Aboriginal housing sector. That Aboriginal housing sector provided for critical housing for Indigenous people, and because of all the imbalances, the reality of not being able to get rentals in the public domain. And that's still a reality factor within our society. If you think it's gone away or this is old history, no, it's not. It's very present and it's very deceptive and it's very, some other words, but I won't use those. But in short, it really, I just wanted to talk about the social determinants and the history of why we're here right now. And we're talking about housing and opportunities for housing. We're talking about all these other different structures. But our house is our home. Our home is our land. Our land provides us with life. Our life then gives balance, and we can then provide that balance to our kids and our grandkids. Without that, we have an instability in society for ourselves. What are the solutions? Well, the solutions really is, the problem we have is the structure, is the institutional racism within the existing structures. Those structures haven't changed because they're designed for non-Indigenous people. And those cultural biases within that allows people to behave in a certain way that then is cultural bias and cultural ignorance and racism all mixed up into one. It protects them. It's like Aboriginal deaths in custody. How many people on this webinar would know that one Indigenous person has died every month for the last 30 years in prison, in incarceration? It's an appalling statistic. We've got more children that are removed from society right now than was in the stolen generation period. We've got kids removed. So there's all these factors. And while we play ignorance within Australian society, this system will continue to happen. And the structure, we are supportive of those structures. We know that those structures exist. We can, as individuals and as a collective, start to work out how those systems work. And it's not just in Australia, I can tell you, it's across this whole planet. And there's this whole colonial structures and configurations that are not conducive to a better and improved quality of life for Indigenous peoples. That's me, Michelle. I'm going to have a drink of water, that is.
About to say, you'd be working up so much you need some rum. Thank you so much, Ross. That was excellent. Such an important reminder about what home really is. And as you and I have talked about so many times, finding ways to have open conversations about the ongoing colonial impacts, in Australia. I always scoff now when people talk about a post-colonial system. It's so not. We're still living in a tricky point where we all have to really muck in, be friends, make time to work together and find solutions together. So thank you, Ross, as always, just wonderful. And we'll come back, so have your drink of water, but don't go away. We'll now hand over to Bevan Cassady. Bevan and I have chatted several times on the phone. It's lovely to finally meet you almost by Zoom. So Bevan was introduced to me by Amy McVie from QCOSS, and I'm looking forward to Bevan's discussion. We had some rich chats about how he does systemic analysis of how the systems work together to then try to understand how things like housing, but so many other issues that he works on, can be addressed more fully. So Bevan, I'll leave it to you to give yourself a proper overview of an introduction, but thanks, Bevan, thanks to you.
Good morning all, I hope you can hear me. Could you wave if you could hear me.
Yes,
Oh,
we can
awesome,
hear you. It's all
awesome.
good.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the sovereign owners of this country, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, both past and present, that have walked this country before us. And I'd also like to acknowledge non-Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people's place in this country as a mark of respect and developing future partnerships and positive partnerships moving forward. My cultural background is I'm of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander heritage. Brother Ross there, I'm up from that country. So Nawagi, Mumbra, if people don't know where Mumbra is, people would know it as Palm Island. But when one of the government policies came out, the Mumbra people were on Palm Island before, so they were forcibly removed from their island. And it was then used as a penal settlement. And in the last 20 to 30 years, we've started to move back onto country, and people know who the sovereign owners of that nation is. My South Sea Islander descent is brought over as ancestors were brought over as slaves is to cut cane, and my Torres Strait Islander descent is of Darnley Island. In particular, I pay respect to one particular man first and foremost. Not many people would know of this man. His name is Kalamo Wakande. He first took the Australian government to court, to the high courts, to challenge the annexation of the Torres Straits to Australia and fighting for the land and sea rights. That challenge failed in the High Court, but it actually set up the foundation of work for my uncle Eddie Mabo to achieve native title in this country. So largely unknown in this country and in but was fundamental to the getting of native title. And so we pay respects to my dad, and also then to 3 Torres Strait Islander men who started up the Torres United Party, and to Uncle Eddie Mabo, and on my Aboriginal side, all of my ancestors there. Thank you, Brother Ross, for that, and I acknowledge your cultural identity and heritage. What I also just wanted to follow on from him was how we view homelessness, and before I get into talk about the project, how we view homelessness depends on how we define our own identity. And First Nations people, we talk about sovereignty not ceded. So I want to underpin my part of my conversation and discussion about looking at it through a United Nations rights on Indigenous people. That comes down to identity. And if I'm taking it from a sovereign identity, then I have a different mindset to how I approach homelessness and housing and the issues that follow on with it. So in order for us to understand the sovereign identity, then we have to understand how does mainstream Australia and corporations view their place in this country, as well as in view First Nations people's place. So the white look, and if I just respectfully say that, the mainstream look is different to the First Nations people's positioning in their, not only in their mind, body and spirit, but also how they look at how a resource is being used. How does this impact on us? One of the fundamental things that, and I'll call it truth-telling session and courageous conversations, understanding the language that we use in which to define First Nations people's realities has the power to influence our understandings to our realities, but also how we act and how we make decisions based on those realities. So like Brother Ross said, I'll probably do data and statistics. No, I won't. I think we all know the data, we all know the statistics. What I essentially wanted to talk about is how do we view and how do we talk about the data? We still use the term, oh, we're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have, it's a national disadvantage. If you've got people living in a country where they have the highest rates of incarceration rates and all of that data that we talk about, and it's perpetual since the beginning of contact, it's not called, and it should not be called anymore, a national disadvantage. It's a national disaster, and we need to have a national disaster plan in order to address these realities. Now, this language is used in all of the oral and the written terms by First Nations people themselves and by non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves. And if we don't start changing this narrative of about, hey, it is not a national disaster, then we're allowing ourselves to be comfortably numb to the situation or uncomfortably uncomfortable, and then just saying, hey, it's there, you know, we'll see something come up. Yes, we might, you know, have our sporting events for, you know, it's what do we call it? Indigenous week, you know, rugby league. And yes, that's fine. And, you know, but the realities are that those are symbolic events, which, you know, can make us sometimes feel, oh, we're good about ourselves because we buy a picture, or we put our, you know, our flags up in our corporations' offices and that. So the truth telling about that is being able to understand the language that we use and how we allow that to influence our perceptions and our actions to it. It seems heavy, doesn't it? Everybody can wave, because this is, you know, I'm one of the privileged, and I say one of the privileged because I have a house over my head, and I have a situation where I'm not living in the streets. So, so in order to do that, one of the things that I was asked to do is to have a look at the housing and the homeless situation. So I just wanted to quickly go over the aims, but I'm going to talk about something totally different in this space about what about housing and homelessness. So this project that I'm doing, it's there to identify national, international best practice frameworks in the provisions of housing services to First Nations peoples. Wanted to identify barriers to accessing services for First Nations people in Cairns and Townsville. Identify the needs and understand reasons for people using public spaces to congregate, socialise and sleep. And identify challenges for service providers in managing housing and sustaining tenancies. And I'm hoping yes, it does work. So in identifying a national and international best practice frameworks in the provision of housing services to First Nations peoples, I particularly wanted us to understand and get an insight into understanding the historical overview of First Nations people's introduction into the Australian mainstream corporate landscape. This is important because it allows us to understand what happens to cultural identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, what happens to the cultural authority, and then what happens to them in their personal lives and in their community lives. So in looking at that, and if I was brave enough to share the screen, I would, but I'm not tech savvy, so I won't, and I'll just talk to it. So in order to understand this corporate landscape history, if we looked at it, and I'll just say before native title came along, and we had issues of, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being considered and called fringe dwellers. And if you don't know this story, and maybe Brother Ross later on will help share this, but in every town you will see a boundary road. Now, most people will think, oh yes, that's a boundary road, and then you'll see another boundary road a bit further out and another boundary road further out. Well, that boundary road originally was set up so that Aboriginal people weren't allowed to come past that point to enter into mainstream society. But as development grew, they got pushed further out, so another boundary road was created. And so when First Nations people started to realise that nobody was dealing with their social issues, the elders and the community people got together and they organised themselves to start lobbying for and getting social services like your Aboriginal medical services, your Aboriginal legal services. So on one level, you had a community of people who had a unified vision, had a unified charters. They had the cultural authority to determine how they wanted to move forward. And they also had the knowledge and experiences and understandings of their communities, which then allowed them to prosper into this. We saw immense progress in the early 60s just because First Nations people were in control of their future objectives and their charters. It's another level of self-determination. But as the greater society started to understand, like, hey, we would like to help, attitudes started to change. Well, then you saw the different, non-for-profits came up, your private industry, the departments came up, and all of a sudden, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people got siphoned in under different corporations. All of a sudden, their experiences, their cultural authority, their voices, because there's a professional power dynamics involved and cultural power dynamics being involved, and started to change what their visions were. We had to then do what the non-for-profit organization's charter was. We had to do what a private enterprise charter was, a department enterprise. What this has on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is then we have this siloing of corporations in order to deal with the same issue. It might be social housing, it might be legal services, it might be, childcare, any one of those social justice issues or social welfare issues. And I've been challenging people on, hey, I've got a First Nations people who works in a different, he's a, if you want to call it, a corporate competitor. So all of a sudden, I can't talk to that person because he works for this non-for-profit, and the sharing of knowledge is now a commercial thing. So all of a sudden, there's what we call a conflict of interest. And I've been saying to First Nations people, it's not a conflict of interest if you have the same objectives. It's the corporations that might have the conflict of interest. Our interest is we want to find the best way in which we can help address this reality that's impacting on First Nations people. So in looking at that, I wanted to just talk about understanding the power dynamics, and I'll come into this this conversation about value in a second. So, understanding the power dynamics, you've got a non-First Nations CEO, you might have a non-First Nations manager, you might have a and at the service delivery point of it, you might have a First Nations engagement officer. Now, it comes down to the value, and when you talk about value, we need to look beyond the statistics about what does the value of that Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person in that organisation actually represent. And there's a personal cost to them, there's a family cost to them, a professional cost to them, and a community cost to them if they're seen by the community as representing their people, but they're not being able to make the decisions that influence change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because of those power dynamics. And what then ends up happening is, you know, the First Nations person might get exposed to being, you know, experiencing cultural violence, community violence, because our psychological violence, you know, hey, you're a coconut, you're not speaking up on behalf of them, you're getting all the money, but you're not, but you know, what are you doing for us? And it is absolutely vital and critical that those individuals of you know, corporations and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people begin to understand that these issues happen to those professionals, First Nations professionals that are happening within here. And then we're starting to see all this psychological impacts and cultural impacts that are happening when that person walks out of that corporation. And so the biggest danger is, you know, when you walk into an organization, you know, if you're walking in the street and you see a black man or woman walking past you, you know, you might say, you might think, oh, he's a black man. You don't know if this black man is a principal research officer, or if he works for, or if he's a CEO of a corporation. It's human nature, which, you know, there's a Sudanese man walking. I don't know what that person's occupation is. So I'm just going to identify them by what is obvious to me, which is he's a black man or he's a person of this cultural heritage. So Michelle, please stop me if I'm going too far.
What I was going to ask Bevan is maybe if you could make some concluding comments in the next minute or two, and then you might have a discussion with the two of you. That'd be great. Thank you.
So yes, so the final part is the valuing of those First Nations peoples within the organisation. Do we value their knowledge, experience, and skill sets? And how are the organisations utilising this resource? One of the things that we talk about is setting up your infrastructure and your vision, so that and partnerships, so that you're putting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in those positions where they can influence the decision making or tell you how to set up your frameworks, and then being able to establish the appropriate partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations that may not have anything to do with what you think relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. The important part about valuing is we often, and I've been saying that, and I said it in the corporations and where I've worked, is how much do you get to do professional induction training on First Nations people cultures? And if people balk at a price and go, oh, that's about $8,000, I'll look around the office and I go, well, that painting over there is about 7,000. That painting over there is about 10,000, blah, 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 blah. And I go, are we valuing pictures over the people? Because when I look at the value of First Nations people, I look at how much money is the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander industry coming into your organisation, but also the corporate risk and the cultural risk that organisations can be impacted by if their service delivery and their understanding of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples is not in their systems. That what's that corporate risk going to happen? Is it better to pay the $7,000 and be informed by somebody who can teach you about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or at some point when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people say we're going to take back control of our cultural corporations, that then corporations miss out, you know, their corporations are at risk because they haven't put the right infrastructure in place. So if I leave it at that, Michelle, I hope that.
Thank you. Thanks, Bevan. I've now got Bevan and Ross pinned, so if you can all see both of our speakers, that would be terrific. Thanks so much, guys. I know that a lot of these issues can be difficult and confronting, both for yourselves and for other people to think about, but I'm just so grateful to you that the three of us at least could feel comfy to talk about some of these really tough issues. I know from being a non-Indigenous person how easy it is for the kind of non-Indigenous community to focus on the issues that are most relevant to our culture. And so, in fact, reminding people that housing issues, like so many other issues for Indigenous people, are more intricately wound up in colonisation and the impacts of people's being moved and changed and shifted and dominated, it actually still has to come back from that place to find some solutions. So perhaps before, I know that there's a question there from Jasmine about land tenure. We might come to that in a moment. If anyone else has other questions, please pop them in. But the one question I'd like to ask both of you is, where do you see some of the more bright and shiny solutions and opportunities for effective, appropriate housing for Aboriginal people actually happening? Can you think of any positive examples other than people going off and doing it on their own? Because I'm sure this audience of folks who are really keen to know how to be part of the solution and how to be part of the good stuff would love to hear what you think works.
Brother Ross, I'll let you go first.
You go below that. Bevan, and I just realised from a culture point of view, Bevan is my neighbour up there near Townsville, north of Townsville, from Aboriginal side, but we also have bloodlines to Darnley Island. I wasn't going to mention the name, but you know, we have our traditional names for that. But yeah, it's funny how two people in the same webinar are closer than we think. I think
my partner is a Williams, so
oh,
that's even closer.
Even closer, guys.
That's even closer, so I'm laughing.
I know my daughters don't have that last name, so anyway, you know. But look, going back to your original comment, Michelle, what did you say?
You really do need a drink, Ross. No, the question is, it was a very bloody long question. I do tend to do that. No, where do you see positive examples? You know, given all the stuff that Aboriginal and people.
I think there are examples around Australia where control is taken away from non-Indigenous perspectives and given back to the communities to figure out what the sort of land design or what the housing structure should look like, what those convenience structures should look like. And some of those housing, from an environmental point of view, you know, from solar panels to capturing water to a whole variety of environmental aspects through to airflow, as basic as that sounds, you're never going to get that airflow through a 3-bedroom brick home in the middle of nowhere, you know, with 45-degree temperatures. So it's about how do you engage Indigenous people to build the appropriate infrastructure for their respective communities or for the local area. The biggest thing Jasmine mentioned about the actual in Aboriginal communities, there's different types of land tenure. The problem with that land tenure is that it's complicated, and that land tenure is generally owned by the communities through the legislation by those respective states. And so how do you resolve all those sort of type? People can't own houses in Indigenous communities, you know, where the tenure is not available to them. So there's all these complicating factors, but we have to go back to Indigenous people to say, okay, what are the designs that you need, and work out an appropriate mechanisms by which Indigenous people, particularly in communities and remote areas, can actually build the appropriate infrastructure for them. And what might be, and government need to really start to look at, if people want to buy their own homes in remote communities, what might that look like? How can they get access to funds when, you know, when you've got banks and stuff, they're not likely to touch people because of the low income, or they're not likely to touch them because there's no equity available to those banks and financial institutions to be able to provide for that funding support. So in reality, Indigenous people don't really have the capacity, in particularly regional and remote areas, to stump up 100% and buy out that. So there's all these complicating factors that just sets Indigenous people up in a wrong way. But in terms of infrastructure, actually talk to Indigenous people rather than the Indigenous bureaucrats or the people who think that they know, because in reality, the bureaucracy itself is the problem in the institution, because Indigenous people can be really well organised within those organisations, and they can have, you know, all these brands connected to their title, you know. They can be project officers, project managers or directors, but the reality is they are answerable to the structure, that the structure is the problem. Sorry, Bevan, your turn.
Thanks, Ross. Bevan, positive
Wow.
solutions or ways forward?
Positive solutions. I'll go back to this foundation of sovereignty. I see down in here in communities here, and I'll give an example of in being part of a corporation, Aboriginal Lands Corporation. I had private businessmen come up and have a conversation with me about, hey, we would love to give you $30 million. All we need to do is to be able to build on First Nations people country. They don't have to pay for the land. All they have to do is pay for the mortgage. It comes back down to legislation and what the community, what the lands, the Lands Corporation legislation is. When I told community, I said, well, when I told the corporation, I said that if people are building property on country, then they own the country underneath. It goes away from this communal thing, but if it's, I try to say it like non-Aboriginal people have that right to own the land underneath their structure. If we're going to ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be able to build their own homes on country, then they should own the land underneath. There's so much red tape around it that it impacts on their abilities to be able to, hey, I don't have to pay for country, I'm just paying for material. Communities that I know around Brisbane here and families that I know, they've just gone and put infrastructure on country, and councils don't touch them because they have this, they're using their sovereign authority to say, we know our legal rights, we're building on country. If you want to come and touch us, if we have to access your main, utilities, then we will start to pay rates. But they're setting up infrastructure on country as an action to restore them to their sovereign identity and what that actually is entitled to them. So there's a couple of things. One of the sort of challenging things that I had a nephew just say to me about 3 weeks ago, hey, Uncle, I went to IBA, the Indigenous Business Housing thing. We're on $90,000, him and his partner, but we earn too much. And yet they can give a family that's struggling on, you got to be in a certain price range to be able to, access that service. So there are a lot of unknowns that we're finding about in terms of the stuff that I'm doing now, where we're just scratching our heads and going, is this socially engineering with intent, or is it not socially engineering and well-intentioned practice based on little or no understanding of the realities? That's the question that many people won't have, or the conversation that many people won't have in this country about it, because if I'm looking at how the systems have been designed, then another part of my brain says, is this social engineering with intent, or unintended outcomes, or expected intended outcomes? I think, Michelle, probably the biggest thing is having those courageous conversations and being allowed to create the safe space so that we have those conversations and then making informed decisions.
Thank you. Thanks, Bevan and Ross. We might finish up with one final question, which is always an important one, I think. How can non-Indigenous people be good allies and supporters to you and the work that you guys do, whether it's housing or other social justice issues for Indigenous people? What can non-Indigenous people do to be useful and supportive?
I think one of the difficult things is people don't really understand the structures that are really disruptive, very diverse, and how they're contributing to a lot of the structures. And look, let's face it, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we're all part of the system that continues to uphold those sort of structures and what those structures are. Individually, we can have a look and examine what type of issues really are confronting the whole issue around Indigenous housing or Indigenous people generally that leads to the sort of numbers and issues that are facing Indigenous people. But it's also understanding the general population. And I think we can't forget the general population as well, that people are on the poverty line and are struggling big time as well, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. There are a lot of people that are on that baseline that are struggling for day to day. And housing is not a priority, and having a home or shelter over your head is a priority. Having clean running water is a priority, having food on the table. So if we can, I guess as a society, rethink about what we look at and what we can tolerate as a society. I think Bevan spoke about it, and that's really that people have been indoctrinated, ingrained with a certain way in a behaviour. And once that indoctrination happens, it's very difficult to unwind that indoctrination around the colonial behaviours. So if we understand what the system is, how that system operates, and why that system is so biased one way, and then you'll start to understand those biases against not only Indigenous people, but other people that are actually in this country.
Thank you, Ross. Bevan, final thoughts on how people can be good allies?
I think the first place to start is having courageous conversations. And this is also for First Nations people amongst themselves to do. So I always say the responsibility is more important for First Nations people to start those conversations and having real conversations, because ultimately they're the ones that are experiencing the outcomes of decisions and actions that are either being made for them or made in collaboration with them. So the first part I would say to anybody working in with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is going and have the courageous conversations and just say, hey, can you teach me? And can you teach me what languages I should be saying? And irrespective of the hat that you wear, what I've learned in my experience is, the job that I turned up and applied for, or got the opportunity to come in for, was I just asked them first up, how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do you know? And the interview went, oh. I said, if you don't know any, then you're not qualified to make decisions and actions that impact on my people. You need me to be able to help you help us. And that for me is the challenge, is when I see somebody who's in a position of power and they have no idea, then I go, you are as dangerous to me as any jail cell. And I think that's the important thing. Be brave to have the conversations with First Nations people. Ask them to teach you. And if they don't teach you, then ask them, who can I have a conversation with? I always say, don't worry about the corporate structure. Just have the personal relationship and you will learn first and foremost about the commonalities within us, and then you can move forward. So that's my little bit of leaving it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Bevan. Thank you. Ross and Bevan, thanks so much for having a courageous conversation with us. And as someone who works very closely with Ross and Mary Graham and other people and who's non-Indigenous, I'd also like to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to be a good ally, do a bit of reading, understand the history, look up the 1897 Act that put Aboriginal people into an even worse position than they were in when the colonisers came, understand the structural and institutional stuff, and then do exactly what Bevan and Ross said, get to know people, make friendships, make relationships, and understand, because every day I'm learning new things from all of my colleagues, and it takes time for us white fellas to unravel the things we think we know. It's a daily task. It's quite remarkable to be unraveling our own cultural understandings. And that's even if you're keen. Imagine all the folks these poor buggers have to deal with who aren't keen on understanding the history and the problems. It's quite terrifying. I'm sure we've all met some of those folks, really indoctrinated into the white fella way is the way. So look, I will stop talking now, but I really can't thank you enough. I know that you're both very, very busy people. So let's all give I like to call it a daggy air clap. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, darlings. And if you did want to stay on, I don't know, Ross, if you've got the time, or Bevan, we're going to have a yarn in a minute about just having a few breakout groups. I've we'll talk about that in a moment. So if you want to stay on, the next hour will be much more smaller groups and discussion, and I'll run people through what we might get up to, but it's pretty open. We just want good ideas coming into a central pot. And actually someone's asked, any chance you could provide a link to that act? Yes, I will. It's a really long act about controlling Aboriginal people and opium. It's a stupid thing, but it was, Mary Graham talks about it as a pivot point. It was the first piece of legislation that triggered all the other separation legislation in Australia and inspired apartheid in South Africa. And a lot of people don't know its history and its massive impact. And it started right here in Queensland. So we're both got to be really ashamed of that crap, and you've got to understand it to really, you start from a starting point where you see people ripped apart and ripped off land. This is not choice issues going on. These are the systems. And what Ross said, you know, you've got to understand these institutional, the layers and layers and layers of institutional stuff that rips control away from Aboriginal people. Like Bevan said, that fella going, how do we fit in? Where's the place we can go and get a bit of support to get a place? Every turn, every corner, there's a barrier. And I'm sure a lot of us non-Indigenous people are familiar with that too. So, all right. Thank you so much, everyone. We might just have a quick 3 or 4 minute break. Let's just to be random. Let's come back at 12:09. That's 4 minutes. Your time starts now. We'll see who can make a cup of tea in 4 minutes or not. Thank you so much, lovely people. And I will press pause on the recording, but I will unpause again. So don't panic. We'll be back. Thank you, everyone. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And thank you so much for your incredible tenacity. You're still with us, and we're about to enter our 3rd hour. I shall not freak you out, however, and remind you how long we've all been sitting down. What we'd very much like to do now is spend an hour opening up a conversation about how more and more of us can collate and collect and bring together ideas about what we need to do in this society to improve housing accessibility and affordability, and the small, humble role that particularly NENA can play in encouraging everyone across our network to support what all of you guys and girls who are the experts, how can we get other people outside the housing sector to support what's being done, what needs to be done. So this is very much about a humble effort to gather good ideas together. And I just want to say 2 things. So NENA has done for the last year, we've been having webinars and inviting all of our different sectoral hubs to put their ideas together into what a civil society strategy for a new economy or a wellbeing economy could look like. We have input from Ross Williams, Mary Graham and other Indigenous friends in our Indigenous hub, input from the food hub, law and regulatory reform, a whole bunch of other issues. So this is really just an invitation for folks to share their ideas here in real time. And also someone asked if this link for this document can stay open. Absolutely, we'll keep it open for at least a week. What happens to this info? We'll put together a simple summary document, almost like a summary of forward-thinking solutions from this week of webinars. And Elena and myself can share it across our networks, but I'll also include it, and it's kind of like the final piece to go into NENA's very first draft civil society strategy. So I'll just show you what these headings are, and then we'll talk about breakout groups. And what I want to say is, if you and your others in your breakout group would like to just have a general yarn and not put stuff in here, that's totally fine. If you would like to put some comments in there, we would very much welcome them. And then you're obviously free to talk about whatever you want. And if you have other issues and ideas you want to share at a later time, I'll finish today's session with an email address where you can just send us your ideas. Again, it's really, really important to us in NENA that we start to build a picture across all of society about all of the issues that people want to see changed to support each other. So this is the simple template. And just remember, if you've never used a Google Doc, the link in there means that it's open. Anyone can jump in. You can do it on your own or in your group. But do be careful. Try not to delete anyone else's work because it is one great big giant share space. And in a minute, when we how we're going to do our breakout groups, that will help you stay a bit more organized. And that way, if you've only got a couple of things you want to say and you can't be bothered getting on here, somebody else can do. So just a simple example, housing issue that we want to address or change, or something good that we want to buy. You know, you can just put, we need to address homelessness well, I live in Brisbane, so I'm really worried about it in Brisbane. Current status, it's really bad. Which players should be responsible? Now, you're experts, I'm not. You might put the Department of something or a community housing something. And then what could NENA's group do? Or NENA as a network, you might say NENA should make sure its members know about these solutions, keep having housing discussions, etc. And you may get further than that. That is obviously a very tragically clunky example, but that's all we're really chasing in terms of some really easy co-created output from our session today. Now I'm going to stop sharing screen. In a minute, I'll open up if anyone's got any questions. But the other thing I just wanted to do is invite any of the week's speakers who are already on the call. And I've written down, we've got Gary, Steve, Elena, Jasmine, Jason, Hilda, Karen Deegan, Mary Faith, Miffin, and Tim Riley have been on this morning. My first question to you would be, would you like to lead a discussion group around one of the topics you've spoken to this week and get other people to share with you and contribute ideas? For example, we could set up a little breakout group on homelessness and crisis accommodation. We could have something on sustainable housing. We could have a group on financial and legal models. We can have a group on Indigenous housing issues. It's really whatever you guys and girls want. The nice thing about Zoom is I will set up these little groups and then I will open them up and all of you can click on whichever one you want to go into. And we might just set, 15 or 20 minutes for a yarn, but it would be made a little easier if some of our speakers who have so kindly accepted our invitation to join might like to facilitate or at least try to handle those conversations. So Gary is saying he'd be very happy to answer questions about community land trusts. Thank you so much. Hang on, let me write this down. They're coming in. So Gary, community land trusts, thank you kindly. Miffin, a group which focuses on who holds the power in relation to advocacy. Excellent. Bevan or Ross, are you happy to have a group talking about Indigenous issues and Indigenous housing? You don't have to if you've got a dash.
Michelle, if I'd probably like to just hear others because then I can, keep doing my sort of searching and searching and searching to see what's happening there and what opportunities. Yeah, so if that's
absolutely fine. Yeah. Someone's asking, oh, I like this one. A group enabling the, oh, I've lost it, sorry. Hang on. A group enabling the middle group of people to get secure housing. Those on low incomes with more than 30K, but not enough to house themselves. Shall we just call that, in fact, as someone who's new to the housing issue, was it Elena, this week they were talking about middle housing or middle group of housing, middle group? Okay, because there was another group about middle women, which I think is the same. And it's a new term for someone like me who's not working daily. Jason saying he'd be interested in discussing small scale resident-led communal living arrangements. Whoa, that's a small one. Okay, a long one, I mean, small scale resident-led, small scale communal living. Okay. Okay. So just give me 1 sec, everyone. Thanks for that input. I'm just going to, I might just pause it there. I think any more groups than that, we might not have quite enough places to go. So it's not letting me change my names. There we go, that's better. My breakout groups are now being unfriendly to me, even though they were wonderful a moment ago. Okay, I'm going to start. Just give me a sec, guys. I've got to close to set up another room. Hang on, that's what's happening. All right, so we'll have a discussion about community land trusts. There'll be a little group in there. There will be a discussion about power and advocacy led by Miffin, and definitely one on middle housing. And I'm keeping homelessness, caring for our vulnerable, sustainable housing. All right, now Ladies and gentlemen, if you go and click on your breakout room button down at the bottom of your menu, let me know if you can't see it. And please feel free, let's from here on, just accept the chaos, join the love. For anyone, I see someone going, what's happening? If you go down to the bottom on Zoom, you've always got that menu bar along the bottom of the screen, and there's a little box, there's 4 squares that says breakout rooms. If you click on that, you will see the titles of these groups, and I'm seeing people allocate. Then you click on join, whichever one you want to join. And if you've made a mistake and you want to go out to something else, that's okay too. So if I could ask you all to spend the next 2 minutes choosing a group that you'd like to chat in, and just yell out if there's something else you want to talk about. I'm sure there's someone else who wants to be with you. That's wonderful. We have one person in homelessness and crisis.
I'm sorry, I can't find how to join. I've clicked on CLT twice. And
did you click on join?
Where's join? When I go to, when I've keeps moving now, I can't find it. I couldn't find join once I had selected submitting land trust.
We can assign you, I think.
I'd love you to do that because I don't want to take up time.
No worries. So to CLT?
Yes, please.
No worries.
Very, very kind.
Very good. You're all doing very well.
Yes.
All right, we've got someone in sustainable housing. We've got 3 in financial and legal models, 3 in community land trusts. Got quite a few popping into middle housing. I don't think my heading of caring for most vulnerable was very useful. If anyone's interested particularly in women's issues, let's put that one there. Caring for our most vulnerable is now women's issues.
Michelle, can I confirm, was your reference to middle housing, was that sort of the missing middle housing? Is that...
You know, Elena, can you answer that question, darling?
No, it was less about sort of the urban context and more around the people who aren't poor enough to get help or rich enough to get housing.
So the middle women, not the missing middle.
That's right. But not just women, the middle, everyone.
Is it strange to have a financial and legal models group and a CLT group?
We could merge them if both are small, I think.
It also depends if people looking at financial and legal issues are not interested in CLT. That's probably a place for them. You're all doing very well. We've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 people who haven't jumped into a group yet. I'm actually going to sit here in the main room. So if anyone gets lost and you leave one group and come back, I will be here. Oh, and Eleanor, how long? 15 minutes? 20? We'll give you 20 minutes. Good luck.
So it's just recording our session now.
Okay, that's fine. And
Is that right?
Yes, I think so. I might even pause it. Eleanor, someone was just asking to be assigned. Did you? Oh, you did it.
I've already, yeah.
Thank you. I actually don't.
Marie, are you okay? Do you need any help? Or maybe you're not there.
I think she's the one who asked to be assigned to CLT. I could be wrong.
That was Lynette.
Oh, no, it was actual message that came through. Excuse me.
Oh, was there a message as
Marie
well?
or Chris, can you just speak up for a moment? Did you want to go into CLT?
Yeah, I can see
Yes,
that message.
I was wanting to go into CLT, but not seeing any prompts to change anything.
Yeah, you're right. Eleanor will do.
I can bump you there. You might just have to explain.
One that's come up a lot, which is financing. How do you get these financial institutions to accept some of these alternative housing arrangements? And I talked about how that happened in the US and how it might develop here. The second issue was maintaining affordability in some of these other models like co-ops and co-housing, because if you don't put in some kind of covenant, it doesn't have to be a CLT, but if you don't put in some kind of a resale restriction, then it'll just become an enclave for rich people. And then the last issue was the kind of legislation that might be needed, because right now the Charity Agency of Australia does not recognize affordable housing for low to median income people as a charitable activity. It has to be the extremely low income group, the below 40% of median income. They won't recognize. I sent them like a 100-page manual from the UK on affordable housing for median income, and they said, no, we don't recognize that. So that's a real legislative barrier. You know, they are currently only allowing us to serve the extremely low income group.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Gary. We appreciate it. Did any of our other speakers want to contribute anything that came out of your discussion? Don't be shy. I think everyone's buggered. I don't blame you. It's been 3 hours.
Go for it, Miffin.
Yes, please.
I was just going to say that in our breakout room, we just talked about, we tried to identify some of the organisations or levels of government or political parties that we might try and target for advocacy and to try and influence, because, you know, what this wonderful week of housing has shown is that there are some fantastic models, there are great workers, there's a lot of discussion between civil society, but perhaps there, you know, there doesn't, and I know this is what you're trying to do with this session here, but, you know, there's no really targeted, you know, core kind of lobbying or advocacy strategy. And where do we start with that? And there's so many different ways that you can do that. And we need to do it from the bottom up, and we need to do it from the top down. So, you know, with each of the political parties, even though they're resilient, with local, state and national governments, but also very important in this space, of course, is Property Council, which is hugely influential and financial. So, you know, how do we kind of infiltrate from within and start having what looks like innocent kind of conversations with them, but get them starting to think about different ways of diversifying housing and, you know, to try and discuss the kind of for-profit narrative. So there's kind of the cultural aspect in Australia's tradition on, you know, home ownership and using housing as an investment mechanism. So there just seems to be a whole raft of areas where it will be fantastic if this week and the NENA and Co-Housing Australia, you know, the advocacy works in kind of bringing together all our diverse but shared knowledge to have something that's really targeted. And when it's really targeted, you know, we can talk about the organisations like the Property Council, but, you know, I have worked with some alongside some advocacy organisations that get right down to identify which individual in that organisation is going to be most likely to give them an ear. And they're really kind of actually a Consumer Action Law Centre in Victoria are extremely good at this, and I've partnered with them on retirement housing and which MPs, what's the background of MPs, you know, do they have aging parents in retirement housing? And you really go in and you meet these people, you bring along people with lived experience, and just those multiple ways of really trying to influence and change the conversation. So it was a great discussion. Didn't come to hugely firm answers, but if I put in that stuff in the Google document, I'm sure all the experts here will be able to add a lot more.
Look, and Miffin, thank you. In a way, you've done a good hard sell for why we need some shared strategies, not for everything and not to create new work so much, well, perhaps a little bit of new work for people to do, but really to bring together all of the organisations that we've heard from this week alone, and that's not everyone, are talking about the things they're already doing and the things that need to be done. And even if we can bring some of that together in this document, or even, you know, if it doesn't come as much info as we'd like, build it up and do a bit more to it next year or later this year. So yes, you're absolutely right. The more info we can all share with each other, the more chance we've got of going, well, who's doing that? We can say, well, this, you know, Co-Housing Australia is working on that. QCOSS is doing some of that. Q Shelter's doing that. Cool. But if there's some gaps or there's things that we need to do more of, then hopefully we can try to work towards that. So,
Michelle, can I respond to Miffin?
Yes, please.
I just want to show you a slide real quick.
Oh, okay. I think you should still be able to share screen, I think.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, so here's the idea. All right, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Mothers Against Expensive Housing.
Yeah, that's a lobby group that you could create. The acronym is MEH. And
Meh.
MEH. And here's another one. Here's what we do now. Look on the right. We beg them. Oh, please do the right thing. Even though you've got 8 million plus the property lobby, against us. How about 1 million mothers march? Because mothers have a lot more power than we do. They can shame politicians, unlike us. So anyway, that's my pitch for a lobby group.
Right. Well,
Fantastic.
I'm all for mothers, being one myself, and being born of one. So yes, that's one strategy, really. A good one. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I have to say, as a mother and as someone who's gone to all the kids' climate strikes and every other strike and every other march, so long as the mothers go and the fathers come with, I think I'm up for that.
Just go sit in their office until they do something.
Yes, yes. Terrific. Thank you so much, Bevan and Gary, for your enthusiasm and capacity to still function at the end of our 3 hours and share. Before we start to wrap up, is there anyone else from any other groups who want to be heard and to share any of your thoughts and ideas?
Are you going to put the Google group on again because it's somewhere?
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, I will, Dale. I'll put it at the end. I'll do that now.
If I just save the chat, can I cut and paste that into the search line, please?
Yes, if you save the chat, you'll keep the link. I'll just see, I'll put it in again.
Yes.
So that's something else. And what I will do, I'll send an email out to everyone who's registered for NENA Housing Week. I'll send a little email out literally in the next hour because I have to go to some other and say thanks for the week. All the recordings will be up on the website, hopefully by next week. Some of the PowerPoint slides are already being put up onto the main program. Actually, we have to change the access, but anyway, and I will also reshare the Google Doc link with everybody so that if you've got ideas over the coming week, please do put them in. Now, the final question that someone asked is, how do I stay in touch with the good folks that I've just met? That is a really interesting issue. How we all network and stay in touch is always important. What I can do is in the same email that I'm going to send out to everyone is say, one way that you can all find each other is to join NENA's Facebook group. Even if you don't love Facebook, and I can tell you now, we've tried many, many times to have other fora. We've got a members forum on the NENA website specifically designed and no one uses it, but everyone's on Facebook. So what I'll do is remind folks, you might be able to jump in there and find each other. We'd certainly encourage you to do so. And if you do lose people and you really want to get in touch, then shoot me an email or nena@neweconomy.org.au. And if we know them, we'll find them for you. And if we don't know, we will. But yes, I will put that link in there. And yeah, let's just have a minute. If I know it'll be a bit chaotic, but if anyone wants to share their email address in there so others can see it, I won't do anything with it. But if you want to pop that in there and go, please contact me, then just go for it now. And my suggestion is all of you take a moment to copy the chat out of there at the end of, before we shut it down.
Can I just ask a question about that? Because it's only a tight time frame and not everybody might be on. When you've got the Google Doc, could you have another Google Doc which is your name and you can put your email address on there and what your expertise or interest is, and maybe just create it, and then people have the choice to put it on, and then people can access it, and then it's there ongoing instead of lost in Zoom.
That's a great idea. I will put that into the list, and if I forget, feel free to just send me an email and remind me. And someone's just asked if I can put the Facebook group link in, so I'll just do that while the rest of you pop in any last minute things you want to share. But while I just look for that link, Elena, did you want to say some wrap up remarks and then I'll close after you?
Yeah, sure. Just thanks everyone so much for coming along, and thanks to all our speakers. And that, yeah, we'll drop all of our social media and other contact info into that email as well. And in the next, hopefully in the next week or two, we might just recover from this. And then after that, we'll definitely be in touch with next steps and how we can collaborate more. Because while exhausting, it's also very exciting. So, and that's because of all of the participation and energy from everyone here. So thanks again.
Yes, thanks everybody. It has been really wonderful. I want to acknowledge all of our speakers and their passion and knowledge and expertise and the time they've shared with us all. And acknowledge that most of us, well, many of us who organise these things are all volunteers. We do this on top of everything else. NENA is run entirely by volunteers. So if anyone has skills or ideas that you want to share with NENA, please get in touch with us. Consider becoming a member of the co-op itself. Join one of the hubs, do good deeds. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people already in our little NENA network, then we want to grow it. And the only way we can do that is with you and anyone else taking some time out to help others. So a huge thank you. And just before we go, the NENA Facebook group page is there. I'm just going to post it again. There's lots of stuff popping up, which is wonderful. And I will just share the Zoom link. Not the Zoom link. This is the Zoom link. Look, it's gone already. Hooray. I'm just going to share the Google Doc one more time before we shut it down. So if you want anything out of the chat, please just copy the whole lot right now. We'll close in about 30 seconds. And Elena, thank you for being an awesome partner in crime. Let's both go and have a Bex and a lie down. I'm sure certain people will understand what that means, but
Thank you
I wish there was still
thank
Bex.
you all. I really want to just say it's been a wonderful initiative, and I feel so heartened to know that so many people are doing so much wonderful work with so much heart, you know, all over the country. And I didn't know it was that depth or breadth. And I am just so heartened, and it brings tears to my eyes. And you're all absolute legends, and thank you.
Oh, that is a really nice way to close.
Yes.
Daggy air claps for everybody. Woohoo! Yeah, you know you want to. Yeah, yay. All right, lovely people. Great Friday, an awesome weekend. If you lose anyone or anything, shoot us an email next week and I'll get Rhiannon to answer it because I'll be passed out somewhere with a scotch. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Elena, too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.